Here's the thing about intelligence. Most people think they're above average at it. That's not an insult. That's actually a well-documented psychological phenomenon. When researchers at Cornell University tested people on logic, grammar, and humor, something fascinating happened. The people who scored in the bottom quarter consistently rated themselves as performing near the top. Not just a little off. Wildly, embarrassingly off. They thought they were outperforming 60 to 70% of everyone else, when in reality, they were near the bottom. And the cruelest part? The very skills you need to recognize incompetence are the same skills you need to be competent. So the people who lack cognitive ability are, by definition, the least equipped to realize it. That's not a fun fact. That's a trap. A cognitive trap that millions of people are sitting inside right now without the faintest clue. And today, we're going to walk through the specific, observable, everyday behaviors that silently reveal when someone's cognitive machinery isn't operating at full capacity. Not to mock anyone, not to point fingers, but because the only way out of a trap you can't see is for someone to describe exactly what it looks like from the outside. Some of these will be uncomfortable, some of them might hit close to home, and if you're being honest with yourself, really honest, that discomfort might be the most valuable thing you feel today. Let's start with one of the most common and most misunderstood signs, and it's one that almost everyone has experienced, but very few people recognize for what it actually is. It's the inability to change your mind when presented with new evidence. Now, that sounds simple. Almost too simple. Everyone thinks they're open-minded. Everyone thinks they update their beliefs when the facts change. But here's what actually happens in the brain when someone with lower cognitive flexibility encounters information that contradicts what they already believe. Instead of processing the new data and integrating it, their brain treats it as a threat. Literally. Neuroscience research out of the University of Southern California put people in brain scanners and challenged their deeply held beliefs. What lit up wasn't the rational thinking centers. It was the amygdala, the same region that activates when you see a snake or hear a loud noise in a dark alley. The brain was treating a factual correction the same way it would treat a physical danger. And people with lower cognitive ability show this response more intensely and more frequently. They don't just resist new information. They actively fight it. They get emotional. They attack the source. They change the subject. They do anything except sit with the discomfort of maybe being wrong. And the behavior you see on the outside is someone who holds the same opinions at 40 that they held at 20, not because those opinions survived rigorous testing, but because they were never tested at all. The opinion became part of their identity, and questioning the opinion felt like questioning their entire self. Makes sense, right? But this goes deeper than just stubbornness. Because the next behavior is directly connected, and it's one that most people completely overlook. It's black and white thinking. The tendency to see everything in absolutes. Something is either amazing or terrible. A person is either trustworthy or a complete liar. A plan either works perfectly or it's a total failure. There's no middle ground, no nuance, no spectrum. And the reason this signals lower cognitive ability isn't because the world is never black and white. Sometimes it genuinely is. The reason is that holding two contradictory ideas in your mind at the same time, what psychologists call cognitive complexity, requires significant mental processing power. It's like running multiple programs on a computer simultaneously. A powerful processor handles it fine. A weaker one freezes up. And when the brain can't handle the complexity, it simplifies. It flattens. It rounds everything down to a yes or no, a good or bad, a with me or against me. Research published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that people who score lower on measures of cognitive ability consistently show less tolerance for ambiguity. They need things to be clear, defined, certain. And they'll sacrifice accuracy to get that certainty. They'd rather be confidently wrong than uncomfortably uncertain. You see this everywhere once you start looking. In conversations where someone can't acknowledge that a person they dislike might have made one good point. In arguments where admitting any flaw in their position feels like losing the whole debate. In decision-making where every option is either perfect or worthless, with nothing in between. The world is infinitely complex, and the inability to sit with that complexity, to hold multiple truths simultaneously, to say, this is partly right and partly wrong and I'm still figuring it out, That's not a personality trait. That's a cognitive limitation wearing a personality trait's clothing. But here's where things get really interesting. Because the next behavior is one that almost nobody talks about, and yet it might be the most revealing of all. It's the consistent failure to think about second and third order consequences. What does that mean in plain language? It means only seeing one step ahead. You do something, something happens. That's first order thinking. Everyone can do that. But what happens after that? And what happens after that? That's where cognitive ability really separates people. Think about the guy at the bar on a Tuesday night, 4 beers deep, saying, "I'll be fine for work tomorrow." That's first-order thinking in a glass. He's calculating one step. Tonight is fun. That's it. A person thinking at a higher level sees the same Tuesday night beer and runs the full simulation. 4 beers means poor sleep. Poor sleep means sluggish performance tomorrow. Sluggish performance means that presentation gets fumbled. The fumbled presentation means the boss remembers it during the next review cycle. Same beer. Completely different depth of processing. And this isn't about being anti-fun or some kind of monk who never enjoys life. This is about the fundamental ability to simulate future scenarios in your mind. Researchers call it prospective cognition, and it correlates more strongly with general intelligence than almost any other single measure. The person who consistently makes decisions that blow up in their face 3 months later isn't unlucky. They're not cursed. They're processing 1 layer deep in a world that operates on 5 or 6 layers. And the frustrating part is that they never connect the explosion to the decision. Because by the time the consequences arrive, the original choice is ancient history in their mind. So they blame circumstances. They blame other people. They say things like, "How was I supposed to know that would happen?" And the honest answer is, by thinking about it for more than 30 seconds. That depth of simulation requires mental bandwidth. When the brain is overloaded, it defaults to first-order thinking because it's cheaper. Less energy, less processing, less foresight. Clarity is what gives you access to the second and third layers. And if you want to strengthen your ability to think beyond the immediate impulse and reduce the internal noise that limits long-term reasoning, take a look at the Brain Song. It's a science-based method designed to pull the brain out of mental overload and restore real focus in just 12 minutes a day. You'll find the link in the first pinned comment. This connects directly to another behavior that's so common, it's almost invisible. The inability to distinguish correlation from causation. This is the person who gets a cold after walking in the rain and is now permanently convinced that cold weather causes illness. Never mind that viruses cause illness and that the correlation between rain and sickness has more to do with people crowding indoors during bad weather. The conclusion was reached. It felt right. And that was enough. Now, everyone makes this error sometimes. Our brains are pattern recognition machines, and sometimes they find patterns that aren't there. But the difference is what happens next. A person with stronger cognitive ability will eventually encounter the correct explanation, recognize the flaw in their original reasoning, and update their belief. A person with lower cognitive ability will do something remarkable. They'll encounter the correct explanation and reject it in favor of their original intuition. Because the original explanation was simple, it was vivid, and it matched their experience. The correct explanation is abstract, requires understanding invisible mechanisms, and contradicts what they felt. And for a brain that struggles with complexity, feeling will beat understanding every single time. This is why superstitions persist. This is why people still believe in lucky socks and unlucky numbers, and that cracking your knuckles causes arthritis, even though the research says otherwise. A doctor actually tested that one. He cracked the knuckles on one hand for over 60 years and left the other hand alone. No difference. No arthritis in either hand. Published the results. Won an Ig Nobel Prize for it. And people still believe cracking knuckles is dangerous. Because the belief was never based on evidence in the first place, so evidence can't dislodge it. It was based on a satisfying story that the brain adopted and then defended like territory. Now, here's a behavior that might surprise you, because on the surface it looks like its opposite. It's the compulsive need to have an opinion on everything. You'd think having lots of opinions means you've thought about lots of things. But the research suggests something different. People with higher cognitive ability are actually more comfortable saying, "I don't know," or "I haven't thought about that enough to have a position." They treat their opinions like investments. They only put them where they've done the due diligence. People with lower cognitive ability tend to do the opposite. They have strong, immediate opinions on topics they encountered 30 seconds ago. Ask them about geopolitics, quantum physics, dietary science, criminal justice reform. They'll give you a confident answer on all of it. Not because they've studied these things, but because having an opinion feels like understanding, even when it's not. Psychologists call this the illusion of explanatory depth. People think they understand complex systems far better than they actually do. One famous experiment asked people to rate how well they understood how a toilet works, then asked them to actually explain, step by step, how a toilet works. The confidence ratings plummeted after the explanation attempt. People realized they had a vague sense of the concept but nothing close to actual understanding. And this is the key distinction. Cognitive ability isn't about how many opinions you hold. It's about the relationship between your confidence and your actual knowledge. When those two things are wildly out of proportion, when someone is extremely confident about things they barely understand, that gap is one of the most reliable indicators researchers have found. But this wouldn't be complete without talking about a behavior that's deeply connected to all of these, and it's one that plays out in conversations every single day. It's the inability to steelman an opposing argument. Steelmanning means taking someone's argument and presenting the strongest possible version of it, even if you disagree. It's the opposite of strawmanning, where you weaken someone's argument to make it easier to attack. And here's the thing about steelmanning. It requires you to genuinely understand a perspective you don't share. You have to temporarily inhabit a worldview that isn't yours. You have to suppress your emotional reaction and engage purely with the logic. That takes significant cognitive resources, and people who can't do it reveal something important. They're not just bad at arguing. They literally cannot model another person's reasoning. They can't simulate what it would be like to believe something different. When they try to explain why someone disagrees with them, they almost always resort to attributing it to stupidity, malice, or ignorance. They're just dumb. They're just evil. They just don't know the facts. It never occurs to them that an intelligent, well-informed, good-faith person could look at the same evidence and reach a different conclusion. And this isn't just about debates. This shows up everywhere. In relationships, where one partner genuinely cannot understand why the other person is upset. In workplaces, where a manager can't comprehend why employees resist a policy that seems perfectly logical from the top. In friendships, where someone keeps giving advice that makes perfect sense for their personality, but is completely wrong for the person receiving it. The underlying issue is always the same: the inability to decouple your own perspective from the situation and see it through different eyes. Developmental psychologists call this theory of mind, and while most adults have the basic version of it, the advanced version, the ability to model complex motivational states in other people, varies enormously with cognitive ability. And this leads to a behavior that's almost painful to watch once you recognize it. It's the Dunning-Kruger effect in real time. We mentioned it at the beginning, but let's go deeper, because it doesn't just apply to formal tests. It applies to every domain of life. The person who's terrible at reading social cues but thinks they're incredibly charming. The cook who makes mediocre food but is convinced they could run a restaurant. The driver who causes near accidents weekly but calls everyone else on the road an idiot. The pattern is always the same. Low ability in a domain, combined with high confidence in that same domain, combined with the inability to recognize the gap. And the behavioral signature of this is very specific. It's not just being bad at something. Lots of people are bad at things and know it. The signature is being bad at something and being vocally, aggressively confident about being good at it. It's the person who doesn't just make poor decisions, but actively gives advice to others. It's the person who doesn't just misunderstand a topic but corrects experts on it. It's the person who doesn't just fail to see their blind spot, but insists they have better vision than everyone else. Researchers estimate that this isn't a rare phenomenon. Studies consistently find that roughly 25% of people in any given skill domain are significantly overestimating their abilities. 1 in 4. And because they're overestimating, they're not seeking feedback, they're not practicing deliberately, and they're not improving. They're frozen in place by their own misperception, and every year that passes, the gap between their perceived ability and their actual ability gets wider. Now, let's talk about something that shows up in language itself, because how someone talks reveals more about their cognitive processing than almost anything else. And the behavior here is the consistent use of overly simplified causal explanations for complex events. The economy is bad because of one specific policy. That country is poor because of one specific reason. Kids these days are different because of one specific technology. Real-world outcomes almost never have a single cause. They emerge from webs of interconnected factors, feedback loops, historical contingencies, and random chance. Understanding this, truly understanding it, not just nodding along, requires the ability to hold multiple causal threads simultaneously and weigh their relative contributions. That's cognitively expensive. And when the brain can't afford that expense, it does what brains always do. It simplifies. It picks one cause, usually the most vivid, most recent, or most emotionally satisfying one, and assigns it all the explanatory weight. This is why conspiracy theories are so attractive to people with lower cognitive complexity. Not because those people are stupid, but because conspiracy theories offer something irresistible. A single, coherent, simple explanation for a messy, incoherent, complex world. Everything that confuses you, one group did it. On purpose. For one reason. That's infinitely easier to process than the reality, which is that most large-scale outcomes emerge from thousands of small decisions made by millions of people, none of whom had a master plan. Research from the University of Oregon found a consistent negative correlation between cognitive ability and belief in conspiracy theories, and the mediating factor was exactly what you'd expect: tolerance for complexity. The people who could sit with uncertainty and partial explanations were less likely to reach for the all-encompassing narrative. The people who needed everything to make sense right now were more likely to adopt a story that explained everything, even if that story required believing in impossibly coordinated secret plots. Here's another one that hides in plain sight: the inability to learn from other people's mistakes. Now every species on Earth learns from its own mistakes. Touch a hot stove, get burned, don't touch it again. That's basic conditioning. Even rats can do that. But learning from watching someone else touch the stove? That's a different cognitive operation entirely. It requires you to observe, to model the other person's experience, to extract the principle, and to apply it to your own future behavior. Each of those steps demands cognitive resources, and people with lower cognitive ability consistently struggle with this. They watch someone make a terrible decision, see the consequences unfold, shake their heads, maybe even criticize the person, and then 6 months later, walk directly into the same situation and make the same choice. When you ask them about it afterward, they'll often say something like, "I didn't think it would happen to me," or "My situation was different." And in their mind, it genuinely was different, because they couldn't abstract the principle from the specific case. They saw details where they should have seen patterns. They focused on how the other person's life was different from theirs, instead of noticing how the underlying dynamic was exactly the same. This is, by the way, the entire reason humans developed storytelling. Stories are cognitive shortcuts for exactly this purpose. You hear about someone's experience, you simulate it mentally, you extract the lesson, and you adjust your own behavior. That's the whole evolutionary function of narrative. And the degree to which someone can do this, can learn from stories, from history, from other people's failures, tracks remarkably closely with their measured cognitive ability. Speaking of patterns, let's talk about one of the most socially destructive behaviors on this list. It's the tendency to personalize disagreement. Someone presents a counter-argument, and instead of engaging with the logic, the person with lower cognitive ability experiences it as a personal attack. "You're saying I'm wrong" becomes "You're saying I'm stupid" becomes "You're attacking me" becomes "You're my enemy." This escalation happens internally, often in seconds, and it transforms what could be a productive exchange of ideas into a defensive emotional battle. And once someone's in defensive mode, cognition drops even further. The brain redirects resources from the prefrontal cortex, the thinking center, to the limbic system, the survival center. Blood pressure rises. Listening comprehension drops. The ability to process complex language decreases measurably. They're not thinking anymore. They're defending. And the behavioral pattern that emerges is tragically predictable. The person stops engaging with the content of what was said and starts attacking the character of who said it. They bring up past grievances. They question motives. They shift the topic entirely. Anything to avoid sitting with the possibility that their position might need revision. This is why some of the smartest seeming people you know can be absolutely impossible to have a real conversation with. Because smart seeming and cognitively flexible are not the same thing. You can have an enormous vocabulary, a prestigious degree, and an impressive job title, and still be completely incapable of processing disagreement without melting down. Cognitive ability isn't one thing, it's a constellation of capacities, and one of the most important, and most undertested, is the capacity to experience intellectual discomfort without converting it into interpersonal conflict. Now, there's a behavior on this list that's going to be controversial, and it needs to be said anyway. It's the persistent belief that intelligence is fixed and unchangeable. The idea that you're either smart or you're not, and there's nothing you can do about it. Carol Dweck's research at Stanford spent decades exploring this, and what she found was striking. People who believe intelligence is fixed, what she calls a fixed mindset, behave in very specific ways. They avoid challenges because failure would prove they're not smart. They give up quickly when things get hard because struggle means they've hit their ceiling. They ignore useful feedback because it feels like criticism. They feel threatened by other people's success because someone else being smart somehow makes them less smart. And here's the dark irony. This belief, that cognitive ability can't change, is itself a marker of lower cognitive sophistication. Because the neuroscience is extremely clear on this. The brain is plastic. Neural connections strengthen with use and weaken without it. Skills that seem impossible at first become automatic with practice. People who suffered brain injuries have recovered functions that doctors swore were lost forever. The brain is not a fixed container. It's more like a muscle. And the people who treat it like a muscle, who embrace difficulty, who lean into confusion, who see struggle as evidence of growth rather than evidence of limitation, those people consistently outperform their measured potential over time. Meanwhile, the people who believe they can't change, they're right. Not because they actually can't, but because the belief itself prevents them from doing the things that would prove it wrong. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it's one of the most heartbreaking things in cognitive science. And here's where we need to talk about something that most people don't want to hear. Because it involves a substance that's so normalized in modern culture that questioning it almost feels like a social crime. Alcohol. Specifically, the relationship between regular drinking and cognitive ability. Not in the way most people think. Everyone knows that getting blackout drunk kills brain cells. That's not the insight here. The insight is what habitual, moderate to heavy drinking does to cognitive function slowly, quietly, over years, in ways that the drinker never notices because the decline is so gradual. Research from the University of Oxford tracked over 25,000 people and their drinking habits alongside brain imaging data. What they found was that there was no safe level of drinking when it came to brain health. Even moderate drinkers, the people who have just a couple beers after work, showed measurable reductions in gray matter volume compared to non-drinkers. The hippocampus, which is critical for memory and learning, was particularly affected. And here's the thing about this that connects to everything else we've discussed. The cognitive abilities that alcohol quietly erodes are exactly the ones we've been talking about. Working memory, the ability to hold multiple ideas at once. Alcohol shrinks the hardware that runs it. Executive function, the ability to plan, to inhibit impulses, to think about consequences. Alcohol targets the prefrontal cortex where all of that lives. Cognitive flexibility, the ability to change your mind, to see nuance, to update your beliefs. That requires neural connectivity that alcohol systematically degrades. So imagine someone who's been having 3 or 4 drinks every night for 15 years. They don't feel drunk. They don't think they have a problem. But every single cognitive behavior on this list, the black and white thinking, the inability to see consequences, the resistance to new information, the short temper during disagreements, the impulsive decisions, all of it is being amplified by a nightly ritual they consider harmless. And the really cruel part? One of the first things alcohol impairs is self-assessment. The same Dunning-Kruger trap we talked about earlier gets chemically reinforced. The drinker can't accurately evaluate their own cognitive decline Because the tool they'd need to evaluate it, their prefrontal cortex, is the very thing being damaged. They'll say, "I'm fine, I'm sharp as ever," and genuinely believe it, because the part of the brain that would flag the decline is offline. It's like asking a broken thermometer to tell you it's broken. The reading always comes back normal. And this isn't even touching what alcohol does to sleep architecture. Most people think a drink or two helps them sleep. It does make you fall asleep faster. That part is true. But research from the London Sleep Center found that alcohol fundamentally disrupts the structure of sleep itself, particularly the deep sleep stages where the brain consolidates memories, processes emotions, and literally cleans out metabolic waste through the glymphatic system. So the person having a nightcap is falling asleep faster but getting lower quality sleep, and the cognitive effects of poor sleep stack on top of the direct effects of alcohol. Less deep sleep means poorer memory consolidation, which means slower learning, which means less cognitive growth, which means the brain isn't getting the maintenance it needs to stay sharp. Do that for a decade, and you're not just drinking. You're running a long, slow, invisible experiment on your own cognitive capacity. And the scary part is that the decline looks exactly like normal aging. The person assumes they're just getting older, when a significant portion of what they're experiencing is actually preventable. Pretty sobering thought, right? No pun intended. But the reason this behavior belongs on this list isn't to shame anyone who enjoys a drink. It's because the choice to drink regularly despite widely available evidence of its cognitive effects is itself an example of several behaviors we've already covered. The failure to think about long-term consequences, the confusion of familiarity with safety, the resistance to information that challenges a comfortable habit. The bottle on the counter isn't just a drink, it's a cognitive mirror. Let's move to a behavior that's going to make some people defensive, and that's the inability to delay gratification. This has been studied since the famous marshmallow experiment in the 1970s, where researchers gave young children a choice. 1 marshmallow now, or 2 marshmallows if they waited 15 minutes. The children who waited went on to have higher academic achievement, better health outcomes, lower rates of substance abuse, and yes, higher measured cognitive ability decades later. And before anyone objects, yes, follow-up research has added nuance. Socioeconomic factors play a role. Trust in the environment plays a role. The original study wasn't as clean as the popular version suggests, but the core finding has survived decades of replication in different forms. The ability to override an immediate impulse in favor of a larger future reward is fundamentally a cognitive operation. It requires your prefrontal cortex to override your limbic system. It requires you to simulate a future state that doesn't exist yet, and value it more than a present state that's right in front of you. And this shows up in adult life in ways that have nothing to do with marshmallows. It's the person who can't save money because the thing they want now always wins over the retirement they can't see. It's the person who can't stick to an exercise plan because today's comfort always outweighs next year's health. It's the person who reaches for a beer at the end of every stressful day instead of going for a walk or sitting with the discomfort, because the immediate chemical relief feels more real than the long-term cognitive cost. Every single one of these is, at its core, a failure of temporal cognition, the ability to mentally project yourself into the future and make decisions from that vantage point. And while environment and upbringing absolutely influence this ability, the cognitive component is undeniable. Here's a subtle one that most people miss entirely. It's the tendency to confuse familiarity with understanding. You've heard a term before, so you think you know what it means. You've seen a process happen, so you think you understand how it works. You've been exposed to a topic, so you think you have knowledge about it. But familiarity and understanding are completely different cognitive states. Familiarity is recognition. Your brain says, "I've encountered this before." Understanding is comprehension. Your brain can explain, predict, and apply the concept. And the gap between these two is enormous. But it doesn't feel enormous, because your brain registers familiarity as a feeling of fluency, of ease, and it interprets that feeling as evidence of knowledge. This is called the fluency heuristic, and it's one of the most pervasive cognitive biases in existence. It's why students who reread their notes feel prepared for an exam but fail it. Rereading created familiarity, not understanding. It's why people who watch a lot of news feel informed, but can't actually explain the events they've been watching. It's why someone who's been drinking wine for 20 years swears they're a connoisseur, but can't actually tell the difference between a $15 bottle and a $100 bottle in a blind test. And studies have shown exactly this, by the way. Even professional wine critics failed to distinguish red from white wine when it was artificially colored. Familiarity with the ritual, the vocabulary, the social context of wine created a powerful illusion of expertise that had almost nothing to do with actual sensory ability. And people with lower cognitive ability fall into this trap more frequently and more deeply, because distinguishing between "I recognize this" and "I understand this" requires metacognition. Thinking about your own thinking. That's one of the most cognitively demanding operations the human brain can perform, and it's exactly the operation that's weakest in people who need it most. Now, there's a social behavior that wraps several of these together, and it's so common that it's practically a cultural norm. It's the reflexive mockery of things you don't understand. Someone encounters an unfamiliar idea, a foreign custom, an unusual lifestyle choice, an academic concept they've never heard of. And instead of curiosity, the immediate response is ridicule. That's stupid. That's weird. Who would even do that? This isn't just rudeness. It's a cognitive defense mechanism. When the brain encounters something it can't quickly categorize or understand, it experiences a micro-threat. The unfamiliar thing challenges the brain's model of how the world works, and updating that model takes effort. Mocking the unfamiliar thing is the brain's way of dismissing the threat without doing the cognitive work of engaging with it. It's the mental equivalent of slamming a door. And research supports this. Studies on the personality trait openness to experience, which correlates positively with cognitive ability, consistently show that people lower in openness are more likely to respond to novelty with discomfort, avoidance, and disparagement. Not because they're bad people, because their cognitive system finds novelty more threatening and has fewer resources to process it. The behavior you see is someone who has a strong opinion about things they've spent zero time trying to understand. They'll dismiss entire fields of study, entire cultures, entire ways of living, based on a 5-second emotional reaction. And the tragedy is that this defense mechanism, while protecting them from cognitive discomfort, also protects them from cognitive growth. Every dismissed idea is a missed opportunity to expand their mental model. Every mocked concept is a door that stays closed. And over a lifetime, those closed doors accumulate into a smaller and smaller world. There's one more behavior that needs to be on this list, and it's the one that ties everything together. It's the failure to engage in genuine self-reflection. Not the Instagram version of self-reflection, where you post a sunset and write something about growth. Real self-reflection. The kind where you sit with uncomfortable questions like, why did I really do that? And what am I actually afraid of? And where are my blind spots? This is the most cognitively demanding behavior on this entire list, because it requires you to simultaneously be the observer and the observed. You have to step outside your own perspective, the only perspective you've ever known, and look at yourself the way someone else might see you. That requires working memory, cognitive flexibility, emotional regulation, metacognitive awareness, and the willingness to tolerate what you find. Research on self-awareness suggests that while 95% of people believe they're self-aware, only about 10 to 15% actually demonstrate it when tested. That's an enormous gap. And the people in the gap aren't lying. They genuinely believe they know themselves. They just don't have the cognitive tools to see what they're missing. They're like someone trying to see their own blind spot. The hardware literally isn't designed for it. And this is why the title of this piece asks you to be honest with yourself. Because everything we've talked about, the resistance to new evidence, the black and white thinking, the failure to anticipate consequences, the confusion of familiarity with understanding, the mockery of the unfamiliar, the personalizing of disagreement, the nightly drink that's quietly eroding the very brain functions you'd need to notice the erosion. All of it is invisible from the inside. Every single one of these behaviors feels like something else when you're the one doing it. Resistance to evidence feels like loyalty to your beliefs. Black and white thinking feels like moral clarity. Failure to anticipate consequences feels like living in the moment. Reaching for that bottle every evening feels like relaxation, like reward, like something you've earned. Overconfidence feels like self-assurance. Mocking the unfamiliar feels like common sense. That's the trap. The behaviors that reveal low cognitive ability are the same behaviors that prevent you from recognizing low cognitive ability. It's a closed loop, a sealed system, and the only way to break it open is to do the one thing that every single behavior on this list makes harder. To pause, to put the drink down, to look honestly at your own patterns, and to ask the terrifying question that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. What if I'm wrong about myself? The good news, and there is good news, is that the fact you're still here, still listening, still engaged with these ideas, already suggests something important. Because people deep in the Dunning-Kruger trap don't seek out content like this. They don't sit with uncomfortable ideas for this long. They clicked away 10 minutes ago, confident they already knew everything worth knowing. The willingness to examine these patterns, to hold them up against your own behavior, to feel that squirm of recognition, that's not a sign of low cognitive ability. That's the signature of a mind that's still growing. And as long as you're willing to ask, what am I missing? The answer to that question will keep getting smaller.